Hey, this is Big John Summers, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the Tennessee History Nerd. By the way, if you enjoyed this episode, I want you to know that there's a lot more content waiting for you out there. We're adding new episodes every week, and we're working our way across the whole state of Tennessee, covering stories from prehistory all the way into the 20th century. So if you like Tennessee history, there's already a catalog of stories out there for you to explore. So, scroll back through those previous episodes. You might just find something you weren't expecting. And again, thanks so much for listening. Welcome to the Tennessee History Nerd. This is a podcast dedicated to Tennessee's past. Every week we bring you a new story about the people, places, and events that have shaped Tennessee and made it and us who and what we are. So grab your favorite beverage, find a comfortable place, and sit back and enjoy. Tennessee is a big state. Not Texas, California, or Alaska big, but to drive from Johnson City to Memphis, that's about a 500-mile drive. So when we're talking about comprehensively covering the stories of the state, it's a big task. It helps to take it in bite-sized chunks, and one way is a county at a time. So, as promised when we began the podcast, we're going to do that. We're going to drive across the state one county at a time, and frankly, the easiest and probably most ecumenical way to do that is to take the counties alphabetically, and thus, in this county spotlight number 3, we're driving across Benton County and looking at its story this week. So make sure you've got your sunglasses on, you're drinking the cup holder, and your seatbelt fastened. We're on the road, and we're headed into Benton County, Tennessee. As you head westward across I-40 from Nashville to Memphis, you cross the Tennessee River, which, thanks to the TVA, is also Kentucky Lake at this point on the map. And that river crossing does a couple of things relevant to our discussion today. One, it marks the point at which you cross from Middle Tennessee into West Tennessee, and two, it marks the point you enter into Benton County. This point is also roughly halfway between Nashville and Memphis. Benton County has a pretty interesting backstory. It feels like we're talking about Andrew Jackson at some point nearly every week in our journey, no matter what part of the state we're in, or even when we're out of the state like we were with the Creek War and at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This week is no different because before it became truly a part of the state of Tennessee, most of the western areas of Tennessee and Kentucky belonged to the Chickasaw tribe. In 1818, Andrew Jackson of Tennessee and Isaac Shelby of Kentucky negotiated the purchase of a vast swathe of land from the Chickasaws that became most of West Tennessee and western Kentucky. That purchase, which is now known collectively as the Jackson Purchase, included what today is known as Benton County, although it wouldn't actually become Benton County until 1835. In 1835, the county was carved out of Humphreys County. It was originally named after Thomas Hart Benton, at first a prominent citizen of Tennessee and later a politician from the state of Missouri. If you listen to episode 11, Red Stick Ruination, you may remember that at the time of the Fort Mims massacre, Andrew Jackson was recovering from a wound suffered in a gunfight following a duel in which he was the second, the backup or the assistance to one of the individuals involved in the duel. Jackson actually was the second for William Carroll. You may also recall that, in fact, doctors had wanted to amputate his arm and he refused, and that he had to be helped into the saddle with his arm still in a sling when the campaign against the Muskogees began. I recount all this background because the man who had shot Jackson in that gunfight was none other than Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton was the second for the other individual in the duel, his brother Jesse, and somehow Thomas Hart Benton and Andrew Jackson ended up in a gunfight themselves. But Jackson and Benton both survived, and both would become active in politics. And perhaps surprisingly, since Jackson and Benton had been bent on killing each other in the aftermath of that 1813 duel, Senator Benton actually would become a loyal supporter of President Andrew Jackson years later. Now, I noted a moment ago that Benton County was originally named for Thomas Hart Benton. That particular fact changed in the 1850s, and that was in part because of the way that things were changing in the United States politically, and more importantly, sectionally. On February 4th, 1852, the Tennessee state legislature voted to change for whom the county was named without actually changing the name of the county itself, when it stated, quote, that the county of Benton retain its original name in honor of David Benton, an old and respected citizen of said county, end quote. Now, to explain why this happened, let me give a little background of what drove this change. Going back to 1820, in that year, the Missouri Compromise was passed by Congress, and its purpose was to maintain the balance of power between slave states and free states in the United States Senate. By that compromise, the state of Missouri was admitted as a slave state, but slavery would be banned everywhere else in the territory. Missouri itself was to be the only exception that was gained through the Louisiana Purchase north of specifically the 36-degree 30-minute parallel. So everything above that would be free, everything below that would be slave, except for Missouri itself. Subsequently, the intent was that each time a free state was admitted, a slave state would also be admitted as well, and vice versa. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which repealed the provisions of the Missouri Compromise, and it instead provided for each state to determine for itself by popular sovereignty whether it would be a free state or a slave state. Thomas Hart Benton, previously a senator from Missouri, was at that time a U.S. representative from the state of Missouri, and he vigorously opposed the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This opposition caused him to be at odds with a large portion of voters in his state who were pro-slavery, and he was defeated in his bid for re-election in 1854. But those same views, because he'd long been opposed to the expansion of slavery into the territories, had already caused him to lose favor with Tennesseans in the county bearing his name. This led to the change in 1852, not in the name of the county, but to whom the name of the county officially gave honor. So in spite of the rather unique history and backstory, officially, Benton County is named for David Benton and not Thomas Hart Benton. If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place-based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. Benton County is roughly a rectangularly shaped county in northwest Tennessee whose eastern border is the Tennessee River. And since 1944, that's been impounded by the Kentucky Dam to create Kentucky Lake as the last reservoir on the Tennessee River before it empties into the Ohio River. The Tennessee River has been a major waterway for commercial traffic since the state began to be settled, and it was for this reason that it took on greater significance in the conflict that tore the nation apart, the Civil War. But even in the years before the Civil War, the Tennessee River was important as a commercial artery for maritime trade in the state, as well as a source of commercial fishing. The steamboats that plied the Ohio and Mississippi rivers also worked up and down the Tennessee River, hauling the agricultural products to market that were being produced on both sides of the river: tobacco, grain, and of course cotton. A very important location in Benton County for this was a place called Pilot Knob. Now, as a brief aside, Pilot Knob was once thought to be the highest point in West Tennessee. And I was even told this when I visited Nathan Bedford Forest State Park, where Pilot Knob is now found. So it may come as a surprise, maybe even to some Benton Countyans, that it's not even the highest point in Benton County. That distinction belongs to a hilltop in southwest Benton County called Round Top, which edges Pilot Knob and another high point called Ward Hill by at least 10 feet. And there are several other higher elevations throughout West Tennessee. So while Pilot Knob is among the highest, it's not actually the highest. But Pilot Knob's true distinction comes from its location and significance for the purpose of river navigation in the days before the navigational aids that we're familiar with today came along. The term pilot for us today usually means the person who's responsible for controlling an aircraft. But long before airplanes existed, pilots were the men who controlled boats and ships. And the term is still used that way as well, even if it's not as well known an application of the term now for most people. But in the 19th century, pilots were experienced men who had learned the waterways upon which the vessels they controlled were operating. Pilot Knob in Benton County, due to its proximity to the Tennessee River and because of its height relative to the land around it, was a reference point, a landmark for those men who were responsible for navigating their vessels on this part of the Tennessee River. In the 1860s, when the Civil War started, two major means by which commerce was distributed was by rail and by riverboat. The combined federal forces under Ulysses Grant had taken control of both the western leg of the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River in the Fort Henry-Fort Donelson campaign, which opened up much of northern Middle Tennessee to Union control. And this continued to be expanded throughout 1862 and 1863. By the end of 1863, even Knoxville and Chattanooga were in federal hands. This means that the rivers and rails of Tennessee were valuable for the Union war effort in logistical support of the Union Army in their efforts to subdue the rest of the Confederacy. The town of Johnsonville, the original town, the one that's under the lake now, was created with this in mind, right across the river from Pilot Knob in Humphreys County. The Union Army built a rail line from Dixon to this point on the Tennessee River that was completed in late 1863 near what had previously been called Knott's Landing and later Lucas Landing. Named by the then military governor of the state of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, for himself, the town that was created there was called Johnsonville. Johnsonville was an important town because it served as a logistical hub for supplies, munitions, and troops that came in on the Tennessee River and then were transported across Middle Tennessee on the rail line. While Johnsonville was located across the Tennessee River in Humphreys County, it became very important to Benton County because of what happened there in November of 1864. As already noted, by 1863, the state of Tennessee was pretty much completely in federal hands. But that doesn't mean that peace came to Tennessee. In fact, it was that in part led to the proliferation of battlegrounds throughout the state as the Confederacy made repeated attempts to take back lost territory, and as partisan and guerrilla forces operated on the fringes in nearly every part of the state. One of the most successful Confederate raiders of the war was Nathan Bedford Forrest, and the logistics depot at Johnsonville was a very tempting target for someone the likes of Forrest. In October 1864, he'd occupied the by then abandoned Fort Hyman on the bluffs above the Tennessee River in rural Murray, Kentucky, and used the elevated position there to attack federal gunboat and transport traffic on the river. In the course of these attacks, his forces actually were able to capture a few U.S. gunboats, and some of his cavalrymen began briefly operating the vessels and jokingly referred to themselves as horse marines. Following this success, he determined to attack the garrison at Johnsonville. On November 4th, 1864, his artillery was positioned on the west bank of the Tennessee River in Benton County, across from the supply base and landing at Johnsonville. As the Confederates completed their battery emplacements and entrenchments, they were discovered by the Union forces, and the Union artillery began to engage them. However, the position of Forrest's artillery had been well selected by its commander, John Watson Morton, and the Union fire was unable to do much damage to them. Forrest's artillery, however, was much more effective during the ensuing artillery duel. The Union troops, fearing that the materiel at the depot would fall into Confederate hands, began themselves to set fire to it to prevent its capture. At least 3 Union gunboats there were either disabled or destroyed. The Confederate artillery bombarded the 28 steamboats and barges at the landing as well, and Forrest observed that nearly a mile up and down the river from Johnsonville was a solid sheet of fire from the burning vessels and supplies. Forrest then withdrew by the light of the fires across the river to return to Mississippi. It was a significant victory at a very low cost for Forrest and his forces, who only reported 2 men killed and 9 wounded. Union forces reported the loss of materiel and supplies at $2.2 million. This is the equivalent of almost $47,000,2026. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on the Tennessee History Nerd, there's another show you might want to check out, Dauphin Island Diaries. Same approach, different setting. Stories from the Gulf Coast, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, back to our story. Johnsonville would never return to its significance as a supply depot for the Union Army during the remainder of the war. While this proved to be a major victory for the Confederacy and seriously damaged the federal supply line for forces in Nashville under General George Thomas, it proved to be too little too late for the Confederate war effort. Most of the Confederacy would surrender by April of the next year, with Forrest himself surrendering his forces 6 months, almost to the day after his victory at Johnsonville. But what happened here in the Battle of Johnsonville is still remembered. Pilot Knob and much of the surrounding area would become part of Nathan Bedford Forrest Memorial Park in 1929, established by Benton County on land that was donated by the local Pafford family. Just a few years later, in the mid-1930s, it would serve as a camp for the New Deal Civilian Conservation Corps. Men from the camp were responsible for many of the public works projects around Benton and nearby Carroll counties from the mid-1930s until just before World War II. In 1963, the county memorial park would become Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park. Today, a large stone memorial is erected in the parking lot of the Interpretive Center at the state park in memory of the CCC workers who lived at the camp inside the park and labored there and around the neighboring areas. A large spire memorial monument is erected on top of Pilot Knob in memory of Forrest and his victory at the Battle of Johnsonville. It sits adjacent to the Interpretive Center. But the river wasn't just a highway for riverboat traffic carrying commerce up and down the river, in spite of its importance in that role. It also provided a living from beneath its waters for many generations. Even during prehistoric times, the indigenous peoples of the area had harvested fish from the Tennessee River for their sustenance, but as the descendants of Europeans settled in the area, they not only fished for their own use, but also to sell commercially. Even today, catfish, buffalo fish, paddlefish, invasive Asian carp, they're all harvested commercially. Commercial fishing on the Tennessee River is managed by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, the TWRA, And while I didn't find any direct evidence of a Benton County connection as I researched this episode, domestic caviar is produced in Tennessee in this region from roe taken from paddlefish in the Tennessee River. And there's a processor in nearby Paris, Tennessee, in Henry County. So it's not implausible or even unlikely that Benton County fishermen are involved in this industry. I just don't currently have any direct information about it. Also, there have been mussel men for generations on the Tennessee River. As we noted in episode 12, A Pearl of a Story, freshwater mussels were harvested for their shells and for freshwater pearls in East Tennessee along the Clinch River, but that also took place along the western leg of the Tennessee River as well. In a technique known as brailing, mussel men in boats, in braille boats, would drag racks containing hooks called brails across the river bottom where beds of mussels were found. The mussels themselves would clamp down on the hooks and would then be lifted to the surface. A number of different species of mussels were desirable for their shell in the button industry in the days before cheap plastics replaced mother of pearl buttons. These were created by cutting discs in the shell and then drilling holes in the disc to make buttons. And this was an important part of the local economy for a number of years. But occasionally, something more precious could be found inside the shells. These mussels also produced freshwater pearls. If you visit Benton County and go to Nathan Bedford Forest State Park, you'll find the Tennessee River Folk Life Interpretive Center and Museum there. Inside the museum is an actual braille boat, and seeing it will help you to understand far better than I could ever describe exactly how these were designed, how the brails work, how the mussel men employed these on the river. Also interesting is just how jealous the different mussel men were of what they considered their own territory, their own spots on the river. The exhibit includes a panel with a story about the owner of a braille boat being saved from being shot by another mussel man when the rounds that were fired were stopped by the outboard motor on his boat. More recently, the freshwater pearl industry got a boost from aquaculture in Benton County. In the middle 1980s, John Latondras and his wife Chessie founded the Tennessee Shell Company in Camden and created the Pearl Farm at the Birdsong Resort Marina and Campground on Kentucky Lake, where Birdsong Creek enters the Tennessee River. Nuclei that were taken from and created from the shells of harvested mussels were then inserted into the lining of other mussels. These seeded mussels were then suspended in wire nets from PVC pipe in the waters of the slough there at Birdsong Resort to grow for several years, at which time they would then be harvested to glean the pearls that would actually then have grown from the nuclei that had been inserted into those shells. Today, the Pearl Farm can still be found at the Birdsong Resort Marina and Campground, although the farm isn't as large as it once was. Also, the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum is located there at the resort as well, and they're naturally pretty proud of this operation, which is the only one in all of North America. And Bob Keese, the second-generation owner of Birdsong, his family's owned it since 1961, he'll proudly tell you that the freshwater pearl is the official gemstone of the state of Tennessee. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, it's probably appropriate that I tell you that Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground is now the first sponsor of the Tennessee History Nerd. Near the northwest corner of Benton County lies the small town of Big Sandy, taking its name from the Big Sandy River, which forms the border of the county in this area. It was formed from the community that grew up around the water tank and fuel yard on the old Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad that was built through the area in the 1850s. In the 1870s, the bankrupt MC&L was purchased by the Louisville-Nashville Railroad. Today, Big Sandy's probably better known for its proximity to the Kentucky Lake and to the Tennessee National Wildlife Refuge. The L&N Railroad that passed through the area was completely abandoned in the mid-1980s. If you've been enjoying the Tennessee History Nerd, there's a way to take a little piece of it with you. We've got merchandise available, shirts, hats, and more, so you can represent the show wherever you go. You can check that out at summersmediaenterprises.com/merch. And as always, thanks for listening. Now, let's return to the story. The county seat of Benton County is the town of Camden. Like nearby Big Sandy, it has its roots in the travel industry of a bygone era. But in the case of Camden, it was from the time of the stagecoach. The community, originally known by the name Tranquility, was a stopover on the stage route from Nashville to Memphis. By the 1830s, it had attained the name of Camden, which some sources attribute to the Battle of Camden in the Revolutionary War. If that's the case, I find it odd on its face because that was a defeat for the American forces, and it was a major humiliation for the American commander, General Horatio Gates, who never held a field command again after that battle. Camden is fairly centrally located in the county, and so it's ideally suited to serve as the county seat, which it's done since the county's formation in 1835. U.S. Highway 70 closely follows the old historic stage route between Memphis and Nashville, as well as the original Memphis-Nashville-Bristol Highway. In 1963, one of the tragic episodes in the story of Benton County occurred. On March 3rd, 1963, three of that era's well-known country music talents, Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins, had performed benefit shows in Kansas City, Kansas, along with others that are still known today, such as George Jones, Billy Walker, Dottie West, several other artists. The benefit that they were involved in was to help raise funds for the family of Cactus Jack Call, who had recently died in an automobile accident. On March 5th, Cline, Copas, and Hawkins were returning to Nashville in a Piper Comanche being piloted by Randy Hughes, who was Cline's manager and guitarist, as well as the son-in-law of Cowboy Copas. They had stopped to refuel in Dyersburg, Tennessee. Upon getting a weather briefing there as well, they had been strongly advised by the airfield manager to delay their return due to storms that were developing along their route. Hughes indicated at that time that he would proceed but would turn back if the weather got too rough. The last contact made with the Comanche, registered as N0007P, was when Hughes requested one final weather report as he sat at the end of the runway before taking off. Over rural Benton County, they encountered the severe thunderstorm, and their aircraft crashed at about 6:20 p.m. Central Standard Time. Everyone aboard was killed instantly. Virginia Patterson Hensley, better known as Patsy Cline, was one of the biggest female voices in country music at the time. One of the premier Nashville sound artists whose recordings were produced by noted producer Owen Bradley. A number of her recordings crossed over into the popular charts, and several of her records would be released posthumously. She was a member of the Grand Ole Opry and known for a number of popular country songs such as She's Got You, Walking After Midnight, Back in Baby's Arms, I Fall to Pieces, Bob Wills' Faded Love, and the Willie Nelson penned Crazy. She was the first solo female artist inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Maybe the best established artist of the three at the time of the crash was Cowboy Copas. He'd replaced Eddie Arnold in the Pee Wee King Band in the 1940s and began performing on the Grand Ole Opry at about the same time. He had a number of hits throughout the 40s and 50s, but his career had waned somewhat until he had a huge hit in 1960 with Alabama, which sat atop the charts for 3 straight months and would prove to be his biggest ever song. Tragically, his daughter not only lost her father in the accident, but also her husband, as pilot Randy Hughes was the son-in-law of Copas. Harold Hawkshaw Hawkins was known for his smooth vocals and commanding stage presence. He was 6 feet 5 inches tall. He was a World War II veteran who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge and was married to fellow singer Jean Shepard. She'd actually recorded the Justin Tubb penned Lonesome 77203, but for some reason her label, Capitol, chose not to release it. Hawkins told his wife that if they weren't going to release it, he was going to record it. And as he was on a different label, he was able to do so. And it was released on March 2nd, 1963, 3 days before the crash. 2 weeks later, it hit number 1 on the charts, where it remained for 4 weeks and would remain on the charts overall for 23 weeks. It would be Hawkins' final single. Jean Shepard was 8 months pregnant with their child at the time of the crash. Today, the crash site is marked with a historical marker just off of Mount Carmel Road and a memorial stone at the bottom of the ravine where the crash happened. Even today, it's still visited by country music fans, paying respects to music legends taken in their prime. And that's going to do it for our drive across Benton County, Tennessee. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip along this county on the western shore of Kentucky Lake. In a couple of weeks, we'll resume our drive when we go to the eastern side of Middle Tennessee into the edge of the mountains in Bledsoe County. But next week, we'll actually be heading northward, almost to the Kentucky border on the Cumberland River, when we look at the Battle of Fort Donelson. I hope you'll join us as we look at where Ulysses Grant first became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, and where Nathan Bedford Forrest first displayed as a field commander his knack for being able to get out of tight spots before disaster struck. And the battle created a challenging set of circumstances between two old friends who found themselves on opposite sides of the battle. Join us next week for episode 18, A Surrender Between Friends. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, the Tennessee history nerd, and I am history. As always, I'd like to take a few moments before we close completely to acknowledge the sources that helped to make this episode possible. For this week's episode, I drew from interpretive materials and exhibits at Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park and the Tennessee River Folklife Interpretive Center and Museum, as well as the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum. I also consulted historical markers both in the field and through the historical marker database at hmdb.org. Entries from the Tennessee Encyclopedia, Tennessee History for Kids, the American Battlefield Trust Summary of the Battle of Johnsonville, and the State of Tennessee's genealogical fact sheets about Benton County. Also, I consulted Bob Fulcher's article, Tennessee's High Points, published by the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. As is my custom, I also spent time in the county itself, visiting the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum, the Patsy Cline crash site, downtown Camden, and Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park. While at the park, I had the opportunity to speak with members of the staff and to spend time studying the exhibits and interpretive panels throughout the museum there on top of Pilot Knob. And by the way, the view from there is amazing. So, to all of those individuals and organizations who work to preserve and share Tennessee's history, I say thank you for making that history accessible. I'm profoundly grateful to the historians, museum curators, park rangers, archivists, and just regular folks whose efforts to document and preserve these stories provides the information and material that I use to create these episodes. Their work helps to make this podcast possible. And thanks so much to all of you for listening. The Tennessee History Nerd is part of Summers Media Enterprises. In addition to the podcast, we produce short-form historical video content that you can find on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And I'm also available on a limited basis for speaking engagements, presentations, and educational events. So if you're interested in having us to speak or collaborate with you, you can find more information through the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening.